Jack and Eric had always been close. Growing up in a tough neighborhood on the outskirts of Chicago, they learned early on that family was the only thing they could truly rely on. Their father left when Eric was just a baby, and their mother worked double shifts as a nurse, leaving the two brothers to fend for themselves most of the time. Jack, being the older brother by 4 years, naturally took on a protective role. He helped Eric with his homework, taught him how to ride a bike, and, later, how to defend himself when the local bullies came around. Despite their modest upbringing, Jack always had a knack for making things work. In high school, he started small side hustles, fixing up and reselling old electronics, running errands for neighbors, and eventually getting into the car repair business. He was never the smartest guy in the room, but he was determined, hardworking, and had an eye for opportunity. Eric, on the other hand, was different. While he admired Jack, he was always looking for shortcuts. He hated the idea of grinding for success and was constantly chasing easy money, whether that meant gambling, flipping stolen goods, or getting involved in sketchy deals that never seemed to pan out. Jack ignored those warning signs for years. He always bailed Eric out, cleaned up his messes, and believed that, given enough time, his little brother would mature. When Jack finally saved enough money to start his own auto repair shop, it felt like a dream come true. He poured everything into it. Long hours, every dollar he had, and an obsessive commitment to making it work. His reputation grew, and within 3 years, he expanded, opening a second location. It was around that time that Eric came to him, asking for a job. At first, Jack hesitated. He knew his brother well enough to see the risks, but at the same time, family was family. Eric promised he had changed. He was ready to work hard, to be responsible, to prove that he wasn't just a screw-up. Jack gave him a chance, starting him off with a simple job handling customer invoices and managing some of the bookkeeping. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. Until Jack started noticing small discrepancies in the accounts. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A few missing receipts here and there, a slight imbalance in the monthly reports. Jack assumed it was just human error, but then the numbers stopped adding up entirely. Payments from clients weren't reaching the business account. Inventory orders were placed but never arrived. When he started digging, it didn't take long to uncover the truth. Eric had been skimming money for months, siphoning off payments and manipulating invoices. In total, Jack estimated that over $50,000 were missing. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. He had given Eric a chance, welcomed him into the business, and in return, Eric had stolen from him? Jack wasn't naive. He knew his brother had always been drawn to fast money, but he never thought Eric would betray him. That night, Jack confronted him. They were at the shop after hours, the smell of oil and grease thick in the air. Jack had the financial records laid out on the desk in front of him. "Tell me the truth, Eric. How long have you been stealing from me?" Jack's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fury simmering just beneath the surface. Eric, leaning against the counter with a cigarette in hand, didn't even bother to deny it. He exhaled a long plume of smoke and smirked. "Couple months, maybe more." Jack felt his hands clench into fists. "You don't even seem sorry." Eric shrugged. "Look, man, it's just money. You're doing fine. You'll make it back." Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had expected some kind of excuse, maybe even an apology. Instead, Eric was acting like it was nothing, like Jack was overreacting. "You lied to me. I gave you a job because I trusted you." Eric rolled his eyes. "Spare me the lecture, Jack. You've always acted like you were better than me. Like you're the responsible one, the successful one. Guess what? You wouldn't even have this business if I hadn't helped you." Jack scoffed. "Helped me? You robbed me." Eric pushed off the counter, stepping closer. "You think you're some self-made man? You wouldn't be here without me watching your back all those years. I just took what was owed." Something in Jack snapped. "Odes? You think I owe you for betraying me?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with tension. Jack's mind raced through options. Call the cops, press charges, try to reason with Eric one last time. But the look in Eric's eyes told him everything he needed to know. His brother wasn't sorry. He didn't regret a thing. Jack exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "You're fired. Get out of my shop." Eric laughed, shaking his head. "Fired? You think that's gonna stop me?" Jack took a step forward, his voice low and steady. "I don't care where you go or what you do, but you're done here, and if I ever catch you near my business again, I will press charges." For the first time, Eric hesitated. He studied Jack's face, perhaps realizing that his brother was serious. Finally, he scoffed, flicking his cigarette onto the floor. "Whatever, man. You'll regret this." With that, he walked out, slamming the door behind him. Jack stood there for a long time, staring at the mess his brother had left behind. Not just the financial mess, but the broken trust, the years of loyalty shattered in a single moment. He had spent his whole life believing that no matter what happened, he and Eric would always be on the same side. Now, he knew better. And one thing was certain. Eric might have stolen from him, but Jack wasn't going to let him walk away without consequences. Jack didn't believe in revenge for the sake of it. He had always been the kind of man who preferred to move forward, to focus on building something rather than tearing people down. But what Eric had done wasn't just about money. It was about trust. And after that night, Jack realized something. Eric wasn't sorry, and he never would be. If anything, he seemed to think he had won, like taking from his own brother was some kind of victory. That was what made Jack's blood boil more than anything. At first, he tried to let it go. He focused on repairing the damage Eric had done, going through the books, fixing the missing funds, dealing with suppliers who had been left hanging. It took weeks, but Jack got the business back on track. He told himself that was enough. But then, one evening, he got a call from an old friend, Mike, who owned a bar downtown. "You hear about Eric?" Mike asked. Jack tensed. "What about him?" Mike sighed. "He's been running his mouth, telling people how he outsmarted you, laughing about how you let him steal from you and didn't do a damn thing about it." Jack felt his jaw tighten. "Who's he telling this to?" "Who isn't he telling?" Mike replied. "He's been hanging around with some guys you don't want to owe money to, the kind who don't take kindly to arrogance. Just thought you should know." Jack thanked him and hung up, sitting in silence for a long time. If Eric had just stolen the money and disappeared, maybe Jack could have moved on. But Eric wasn't just content with taking from him. He wanted to rub it in. And worse, he was now mixing with dangerous people, the kind who could get him in real trouble. Jack knew his brother well enough to understand one thing. Eric was always looking for the next big score. He had spent his whole life chasing easy money, and now that he had burned his bridge with Jack, he would be looking for another way to get rich quick. That was when the idea started forming in Jack's mind. If Eric was so desperate to make money, Jack would give him an opportunity, one he couldn't resist. And this time he'd make sure Eric lost far more than he had stolen. The setup. Jack reached out to a mutual acquaintance, someone Eric didn't know well but who moved in the same circles. Trevor, a guy Jack had done business with in the past. Trevor was known for making money in real estate deals, but he also had a reputation for playing a little dirty when needed. Jack laid out his plan, and Trevor was more than happy to help. Together, they crafted the perfect opportunity, an exclusive high-runner investment in a high-end development project. The deal was structured to look like a once-in-a-lifetime chance. Low buy-in, guaranteed returns, the kind of thing that would make someone like Eric think he had an inside track. The key was making it just real enough. Trevor already had access to some legitimate real estate deals, and they used one as the foundation. Fake documents were drawn up, complete with investment agreements, purchase contracts, and property records that looked completely above board. A few calls were made to some of the right people, enough to create the illusion that this was a real thing, something only the smartest investors would get in on. Then came the bait. Jack made sure the information got to Eric the way it had to through a third party. If Jack had gone to Eric directly, his brother would have been suspicious. But hearing about it through someone else, through a mutual acquaintance who swore up and down that this was the deal of the year, that made it irresistible. And just as Jack expected, Eric took the bait. The trap. Eric had never been good at thinking things through. He had always been the kind of person who acted first, convinced he was the smartest guy in the room, convinced that everyone else was just too slow to see the opportunities he saw. Within a week, he was calling Trevor asking for details. He played it cool at first, acting like he wasn't too eager, but Trevor, playing his role perfectly, told him the deal was closing fast, that big investors were already in, and that if Eric wanted a piece, he needed to move now. That was all it took. Eric liquidated what little he had left, but more importantly, he borrowed. He had burned too many bridges to go through legitimate channels, so he turned to the kinds of lenders who didn't take missed payments lightly, the kind of guys who expected their money back with interest, or else. Jack watched it all unfold from a distance. He had Mike keeping tabs on Eric, and everything was going exactly as planned. Within 2 weeks, Eric had pulled together nearly double what he had stolen from Jack. He was all in. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the deal vanished. Trevor, playing his part flawlessly, went dark. Phones disconnected, emails unanswered. The office they had used for meetings? Empty. The property records? Non-existent. Eric was left with nothing. To fall out. Jack wasn't there to see the moment Eric realized he had been played, but he imagined it. The sinking feeling in his brother's gut when he realized he had handed over everything to a ghost. The panic as the debts he had taken on came due. The slow, creeping understanding that he wasn't just broke. He was in real trouble. It wasn't long before Eric came looking for help, and when he did, Jack made sure he knew exactly what had happened. They met in the same shop where the first betrayal had taken place. This time, Eric wasn't cocky. He wasn't laughing. He looked pale, desperate, like a man who had seen the walls closing in around him. "Jack, I need help," Eric said, voice unsteady. I messed up, man. I don't have the money. These guys, they're serious. They're gonna come after me." Jack leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "How much do you owe?" Eric swallowed hard. 70 grand. Jack let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of money." Eric ran a hand through his hair. I know, but you have it. You can help me." Jack studied him for a long moment, then shook his head. "No." Eric's face twisted in desperation. "Come on, man. You have to." Jack's expression didn't change. "You remember what you said to me when I caught you stealing?" Eric blinked, confused. Jack's voice was calm. "You said, 'It's just business, Jack.'" Eric opened his mouth, but no words came out. Jack pushed off the counter, walking toward the door. "You're on your own, Eric." Eric was left standing there, looking smaller than Jack had ever seen him. Jack didn't feel happy about what he had done, but he didn't regret it either. Because now, Eric finally understood the cost of betrayal. Eric had always been reckless with money, but this time he was in deeper than ever before. 70 grand wasn't just an inconvenience. It was life-altering, and the people he owed it to weren't the type to send polite reminders. They were the kind of men who collected debts with their fists, and if that didn't work, with something worse. Jack didn't need to see Eric fall apart in real time to know exactly how it was playing out. First came the denial, the refusal to believe that he had been tricked. Eric probably spent days trying to track down Trevor, calling every number he had, banging on doors, demanding answers. Then came the realization that it was over, that the money was gone. And after that, the panic. Because once the lenders started calling, once they started hinting at what would happen if they didn't get their money, Eric would know just how bad things really were. For a while, Jack expected Eric to disappear, maybe try to skip town, find some new scam, or beg someone else for help. But then, late one night, Eric showed up at the shop again. Jack had just finished closing up. The place smelled like oil and metal, the way it always did at the end of a long workday. He was locking the front entrance when he heard a voice behind him. "Jack." He turned. Eric was standing in the dim light of the parking lot, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked worse than before. His usual arrogance had drained away, replaced by something raw and desperate. His eyes darted around like he was expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. Jack didn't say anything, just waited. Eric took a shaky breath. Look, man, I know I screwed up. Jack crossed his arms. Yeah, you did. I need help. Eric's voice cracked. I don't have the money. These guys, they're serious, Jack. They showed up at my place, broke my door in, said if I don't pay up soon, they'll start taking it out of my hide. Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. Let me get this straight, he said slowly. You stole from me, bragged about it to anyone who'd listen, then took out loans you couldn't afford, blew the money on a fake deal, and now you're shocked that it blew up in your face? Eric flinched. I know I was an idiot, okay? But I don't have anywhere else to go. Jack looked at his brother, really looked at him. The kid he had once protected, the kid he had defended all their lives, now standing here one step away from complete ruin. And for a moment, just a moment, Jack almost caved. But then he remembered the smirk on Eric's face the night he admitted to stealing, the way he had laughed about it, like Jack was some kind of fool for trusting him. Jack took a deep breath. I told you, Eric, you're on your own. Eric's expression twisted into something ugly. Come on, man, you have to help me. You've got money, I know you do. Jack shook his head. It's not about the money. It's about the fact that you don't learn. Every time you screw up, someone bails you out and you never change. I'm not doing it anymore. Eric's hands balled into fists. So that's it? You're just gonna leave me to get my ass kicked? Jack met his gaze, his voice quiet but firm. You did this to yourself. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Eric let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. You think you're better than me, don't you? Jack exhaled sharply. No, Eric. I just think I'm smarter. Eric's face twisted in anger, but he didn't say anything else. He just turned and stalked off into the night. Jack stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty parking lot, feeling a weight settle deep in his chest. He had won. He had set Eric up, made him pay for what he did. But as he locked up and walked to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that, in some way, he had lost something too. Because no matter what Eric had done, he was still his brother. And now he had no idea what would happen to him. Jack didn't see Eric for weeks after that night. At first, he assumed his brother had skipped town, running from the debt collectors like he always ran from his problems. It wouldn't have surprised him. Eric had never been the type to face consequences head-on. But then, one evening, Jack got a call from Mike. You might want to come down to the bar, Mike said. Your brother's here, and he looks like hell. Jack hesitated. He had told himself he was done with Eric, that he wasn't going to clean up another mess. But something in Mike's voice made him grab his keys and head downtown. When he walked into the bar, it took him a second to recognize Eric. His little brother, who had always carried himself with a cocky swagger, now looked like a man who had been put through a meat grinder. His lip was split, one eye swollen nearly shut, bruises creeping out from under the collar of his jacket. His hands were trembling as he nursed a glass of whiskey, staring blankly at the bar top. Jack took a slow breath, then walked over. Eric. Eric flinched at the sound of his voice, then turned his head slightly. Figured you'd show up eventually. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. Jack pulled out the stool next to him but didn't sit. Who did this to you? Eric let out a hollow chuckle. Who didn't? He swirled the whiskey in his glass, wincing slightly as the motion made his shoulders shift. Loan sharks finally caught up to me. Guess they got tired of waiting for their money. Jack clenched his jaw. He had known this was coming, but seeing Eric like this, beaten, broken, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Did they let you off the hook? Jack asked, already suspecting the answer. Eric let out a bitter laugh. Not even close. They gave me one more week. After that, well, let's just say they weren't shy about describing what happens to guys who don't pay up. Jack exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He had wanted Eric to suffer, to understand the weight of his choices. But this was something else. If Jack did nothing, Eric wasn't just going to lose money, he was going to lose everything. For the first time in a long time, Jack didn't feel like he was looking at an enemy. He was looking at his little brother, the same kid he had taught to ride a bike, the same kid he had protected from schoolyard bullies. And despite everything, despite the betrayal, the anger, the messes, he couldn't just let Eric get himself killed. Jack sat down. "All right," he said, "let's fix this." Eric looked up at him, confusion flickering in his bruised eyes. "What?" Jack sighed. "You heard me. We're getting you out of this." Eric blinked, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Why?" Jack met his gaze. "Because you're my brother." Jack didn't have 70 grand sitting around, but he did have something just as valuable: connections. First, he called Trevor. The guy who had helped him set up Eric's fake investment scam still owed him a few favors, and Jack intended to collect. "You still got a line on those loan sharks?" Jack asked. Trevor hesitated. "Jack, you don't want to get involved with those guys." "I already am," Jack said. "Set up a meeting." Trevor sighed but agreed. The meeting was set for the next night. Jack brought Eric along, though he wasn't sure if his brother was more afraid of the loan sharks or of what Jack might say to them. When they arrived at the abandoned warehouse where the meeting was set, 3 men were waiting. Their leader, a thick-necked guy named Marco, leaned against a crate, watching as Jack and Eric approached. "Well, well," he said, smirking, "if it isn't our favorite investment genius." He nodded toward Eric. "How's that real estate empire working out for you?" Eric swallowed hard but didn't respond. Jack stepped forward. "I want to make a deal." Marco chuckled. "That so? You here to pay off your little brother's debt?" "No," Jack said. "I'm here to offer you something better." Marco raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Jack pulled out a folder from his jacket. Inside were detailed records, bank transactions, email exchanges, and dirt on a rival loan shark operation that Marco had been butting heads with for years. Jack had spent the past day calling in every favor he had, digging through financial records, and piecing together a case that would let Marco take down one of his biggest competitors. "You wipe Eric's debt," Jack said, "and this is yours." Marco opened the folder, flipping through the pages. His expression changed as he read. "Where the hell did you get this?" Jack didn't answer. Marco studied him for a long moment, then closed the folder. "You're smarter than your brother, I'll give you that." He glanced at Eric. "Fine, debt's cleared, but don't come crawling back next time, kid. There won't be a next time." Eric nodded quickly, not daring to say anything else. As they walked out of the warehouse, Eric let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how you pulled that off." Jack shot him a look. "You're not going to ask how I pulled it off, and you're not going to screw up again." Eric nodded, shame flickering across his face. "I won't." Jack didn't say anything. He had heard that promise too many times before. The aftermath. For a while, things were quiet. Eric kept his head down, avoiding trouble, at least as far as Jack knew. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them wasn't as heavy as it had been before. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. One night, a few weeks later, Eric showed up at the shop. Jack looked up from under the hood of a car. "You lost?" Eric shook his head. "I got a job." Jack raised an eyebrow. "A real one?" Eric smirked, but it was different this time. There was no arrogance behind it. "Yeah, working construction. It's not glamorous, but it's a paycheck. Honest work." Jack wiped his hands on a rag. "Good." Eric hesitated. "Look, I know I can't change what I did, and I know you probably don't trust me, but I want to fix things. I want to be better." Jack studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." It wasn't an acceptance, it wasn't a promise, but it was a start. As Eric left the shop that night, Jack watched him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope.